Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we're going to do a screencast on criticisms of FDR and the New Deal. Now, what makes this so interesting and unique is FDR arguably could be the greatest president of all time. And I mean, when you're ranked first out of almost 50 presidents, that's a big deal. Yet there were many people that thought he was no good, he was bad, and so we're going to kind of explore some of his weaknesses and critiques. So yeah, well, let's get at it. So, all right. So our objective today is to understand all the people that were protesting FDR and against him, and of course, what FDR's response would be to these people. So let's go all the way back to 1932 when FDR basically clobbered Herbert Hoover in that election. After all, Herbert Hoover had done very little to support the American people during the Great Depression. So let's talk about it. He gets crushed. Goodbye, Hoover. And FDR says, I have a new deal for the American people. Whatever cards you had before, give them back to me. I'm going to give you better cards. It's kind of a poker metaphor, I believe. So that said, the American people are happy. No more laissez-faire. FDR and his New Deal are going to support them and help them. And of course, there's a very big but, and that is nobody is perfect. So he's going to get criticized for lots of his actions and fall short. So we'll see what we can learn. It's always important to see where people fall short to see what we can learn from them. So who was attacking the New Deal? Well, at first there was this Senator Huey Long, and it was maybe FDR's number one rival. Here he is, Mr. Huey Long, seems happy in that picture. He was nicknamed Kingfish. He was also a Democrat, just like FDR. He was from Louisiana, and he got popular by criticizing FDR in the New Deal. I mean, you always want to go after whoever's on top to become popular. He was known as a populist because populists basically become popular by saying that the American people, the common man, are under attack of the privileged, of the rich, of the people in power. And that's a type of politician or person, always telling people that they're victims, that society is unfair and going after them. So Huey Long was maybe one of the original, most famous populists. And his message, again, was the wealthy and to do and good to and the privileged people are basically hurting the American people, and only he could balance these things off. And he had a plan, and the most famous part of his plan was called the Share Our Wealth Plan. And his plan was to soak the rich, basically take almost all their money away and then share it. And again, hence Share Our Wealth, which is the name of the plan. One thing he said was he's going to cap the annual amount of money that you can make at $1 million. And that means there'd be more money for everybody else. 100% tax on any saved money over 100 million. So that's going to take a bunch of money. When somebody dies, inheritance that you pass on to your kids will be capped at 5 million. So all that extra money that the rich keep passing down to their children and children and children will become released to everybody else and of course to the government. And that's going to result in some good government, some extra money that can go to the people. The Share Our Wealth program was popular. Who does not want society to be more equal? And I guess the rich, but who knows? So some of the benefits he talked about under the Share Our Wealth program was where he's going to give every single year $5,000 to each family from the money he seizes from the rich. He's also going to give, just to start, I mean, but then after that, every year after that, 2 to 3,000. Every man will be a king. That was his phrase. And the American people, the common man, were happy with this. And Share Our Wealth Club started up in thousands of towns across America. There were over 27,000 total of them. Like little hometown Share Our Wealth, We Love Huey Long groups. 7.5 million Americans. I mean, that is quite the group. So anyway, FDR's reaction to this was, and here's a lesson from history. When you have an opponent that's gaining power by criticizing you and they have all these ideas and the American people are starting to support them, what you immediately do is steal their best idea. That way they can't, I mean, you take their idea and you implement it. Now you can brag about their idea. It's now credited to you. And that takes away a little bit of their thunder. So that's what he does. What FDR does is he implements a progressive income tax. And a progressive income tax is basically everybody who makes money pays taxes on it, but we're going to take extra money from people that make more money. And that wasn't a thing before FDR. It's called a graduated income tax or progressive. It goes up, up, and up the more money you make. And that's very similar to the Share Our Wealth program. We're going to take money more from the rich. Also, FDR created what was called the estate tax. This is to prevent rich people from just taking all of their money and passing it on to their rich children. And those rich children pass on their rich land and money to their children. And the wealth of our country is wrapped up by these same old school rich people. So the estate tax says if you own a huge amount of money or land And over a certain amount, that's going to be seized by the government and redistributed amongst the people. And that kind of captures that institutionalized wealth and privilege that just keeps getting passed on. So kind of, again, remember that lesson is just to steal the best ideas of your enemies so they can no longer talk negatively about you because you're supporting their ideas. And of course, taking credit for them, which is even better. Criticisms of Huey was that Huey Long was that he was dangerous, even though he had those ideas, that he was a demagogue. I mean, he was a super charismatic speaker. But a demagogue is a negative type of political leader. It's a leader that doesn't offer ideas and reason to get popularity. Instead, they get popular out of fear. They tell people that their lives are over, that they're at risk, and people get so scared that they support them. So they get angry. They get people really mad and make them feel like victims. And they lead with emotion rather than ideas. And you are a victim, and this group is out to get you. And this type of politician, it's difficult because if anybody criticizes them, they label them the enemy and make them sound awful. So just remember, a demagogue is a type of politician that gets powerful out of by creating fear rather than winning people over with their great ideas. So ultimately, yes, Huey Long is going to become popular and people are going to be like ready to support him. And a lot of people think he's going to turn into a dictator and take over this country because this was the time of Hitler, right? The exact same time. And that's what Hitler did. But in the 1936 election, where he would have gone toe to toe with FDR, he got assassinated. Somebody took him out. And I mean, again, not so good. So FDR is going to survive that rivalry and so on, and he's going to steal the best ideas from Huey Long. Another criticism of FDR, besides Huey Long and his share of the wealth and soak the rich in estate tax, is going to be a guy by the name of Dr. Francis Townsend. Dr. Francis Townsend is another person that criticized the New Deal and FDR and society, and he got popular doing that same thing. And his concern was not so much the poor, but his concern was actually the elderly. He's saying the elderly are in a terrible position, very vulnerable and hurt in our society. Nobody takes care of them. In fact, he was kind of right. And I guess he was right to criticize FDR because FDR hadn't done anything to overwhelmingly help the elderly. So his vision basically was called the Townsend Plan. And that plan basically said that what our government should do is to create a pension program for everybody. Now, at the time, if you were part of a really rich company, even after you retired, the rich company would give you payments to take care of you when you were old, and that's a pension program. But most people didn't have a pension. So what Townsend said was the government should create a pension program, should take extra money from everybody who works, and then give it back to them when they're like 65. And that means we will be, when we're most vulnerable, the government will take care of us. So the Townsend Plan basically said $200 per month should be given to people when they're old. Certain requirements was you had to be 60 plus years old, and you couldn't be a criminal or you'd be kicked out of the program. When you get the money, you have to spend it within 30 days. That whole point was we were in the middle of the Great Depression, and spending money gets you out of a depression. So 3,400 local clubs, Townsend clubs. So we need to take care of our elderly. FDR is not doing enough. Millions of angry supporters, and FDR took a look at Townsend and said, you know what, I'm going to do the same thing I did to Huey Long. I'm going to steal his best idea. And that way he won't be able to criticize me anymore. And he created the program in 1935 called Social Security. And Social Security basically takes extra money in addition to the income tax away from everybody who works and puts it in a pot. And then when you get older, particularly 62 through 72, you can retire off of that. And that's Social Security. It's an amazing program. Some people say one of the best laws ever created because you are very vulnerable when you're old. And FDR, thank you for creating that program. Of course, he stole the idea from Townsend, but oh well. So another criticism of FDR was not just Huey Long and Francis Townsend, and it's going to be African Americans. Now, number one, a lot of people said that African Americans are getting lynched and attacked, particularly in the South. And some people, particularly northern liberals, wanted to pass an anti-lynching bill, basically a bill that allowed the federal government to go into the South and stop African Americans from getting murdered and to investigate these murders to prevent them. And these lynchings just happened at such a high percentage from 1882 to 1951. Over 3,437 known African Americans were killed, and over 1,000 white Americans that supported African Americans. Where did they take place? Yes, of course, mostly in the South, but in other places. And those southern states could not be trusted to deal with this. So the federal government needed to go in and tell them what to do and prevent this and create laws. Anyway, in 1900, the first anti-lynching bill was proposed, and people said, no, we don't want people to get lynched, but we don't want the states being pushed around by this faraway federal government that's acting like the British did once, No, we want the states to handle this. The states can handle it. So even though people didn't want lynching, most people, there was no support for the anti-lynching bill because nobody wanted the federal government to go into their state and tell them what to do. Kind of a states' rights argument. So southern states in lynching, they, basically rape was going on, and oh, I'm sorry. Um, basically, the reason why the South publicly said we're against the anti-lynching bill is number one, there was this cultural belief that African American men were highly sexualized and were raping white women all the time, and that these lynching was only happening when African American raped white women, and therefore they were justified and not anything to get upset about. And of course, this was all kind of stereotypical racist kind of lies, but that was one justification why people were against a lynching bill. I mean, how could you be against a bill that's going to stop people from getting lynched? But that was the belief that so many Southerners had. Second piece was that states' rights that we talked about, that states should not let the federal government even do good things because it will get too powerful and that could lead to bad things. So 30 years later, in 1933, after the first anti-lynching bill did not pass, we have President Roosevelt around, but he's not willing to propose it. He's not willing to support it or even talk about it. Because FDR knew that if he supported the anti-lynching bill, that meant ultimately that the federal government would be going into the South, telling them what to do, taking their freedom away in a way. And Southern Democrats, people from his own party, would hate him and would turn against him, and therefore would not support him in his thousands of bills that he was trying to pass as part of the New Deal. FDR also knew that the poll tax, FDR had a priority. He basically wanted to pass the poll tax. Basically, what was happening in southern states is southern states had a poll tax. Basically, they would charge money in order to vote, and that would prevent African Americans from voting because African Americans were systemically poor and they couldn't afford or wouldn't choose to spend their money on a poll tax. So, and what really, really made it bad about the poll tax was that you didn't just have to pay to vote that year. If you were an African American 50-year-old, you wanted to vote, you had to pay the poll tax for every year that you were eligible to vote. That meant every single year, all the way back to when you were like 18. And African Americans, men or women, couldn't afford to do that. So even if they had a little money, they wouldn't be able to do it. So President Roosevelt, the poll tax was used to the poll tax was had to be paid when you wanted to vote. And so FDR knew it was bad, but he wasn't willing to pass a law to get rid of the poll tax. And that if he had, then African Americans could vote, and then they could vote for people that were actually fair-minded to be in Southern leadership roles, and that would change laws to make them better. You have to remember down south, the leaders of the police were voted in; they were elected. So now, I mean, so basically, FDR did nothing to get rid of the poll tax, and of course, didn't support the anti-lynching bill. And these are two negatives. The Agricultural Adjustment Act is another negative. Basically, wealthy farmers, if you remember as part of our study of the Great Depression, FDR passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act. What it did was it basically paid farmers not to grow crops because the idea was farmers' crops, there were so many of them that they were worth almost nothing, and then therefore farmers were poor because they couldn't sell their crops for anything. Well, anyway, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was going to pay billions of dollars to farmers to grow less crops. So with less crops, they became more valuable. The farmers could sell them for a higher price, and then therefore farmers would be able to survive. But here's the unintended consequence. Wealthy farmers got tons of money to grow less crops, and that was good for them. But when they got that money, they grew less crops. And when you grow less crops, that means you lay off all of your laborers because you're not going to grow those crops. And who were the laborers on the bottom of the food chain for the farmers? African American farmers and poor white farmers. They were now fired. So even though the AAA program, Agricultural Adjustment Act, is going to help collectively farmers by raising the price of goods, it's going to result in a huge unemployment for African American farmers. Number four, maybe concerning African Americans and FDR, this is actually a positive story. Marian Anderson was one of the most famous opera singers in the world. She was African American. She traveled around the world. People loved her voice. She was amazing. So anyway, she's traveling around the world and she comes to Washington, D.C., which is not quite in the north or the south, right in the middle, right? But in that federal land, the segregation was still allowed, and Marian Anderson wanted to sing in Constitutional Hall, which is the most prestigious place to sing and have concerts there even today. And the Constitutional Hall was run by a group called the Daughters of the American Revolution, which was a conservative group at the time. And they basically said, no, this is a white institution. We're not letting her sing here, as famous and awesome as she was. So Eleanor Roosevelt, which was a part of this group, wrote a letter, and this is literally the letter, that basically said, however, I am in complete disagreement with the attitude taken in refusing Constitutional Hall to this great artist. You have set an example which seems to me unfortunate, and I feel obliged to send to you my resignation. You had an opportunity to lead in an enlightened way, and it seems to me that your organization has failed." She quit the organization. And she said, "All right, Marian Anderson, if they won't let you sing here, I'm going to hook you up to sing in even a more prestigious place. My husband's the president of the United States, and we're going to let you sing on the Lincoln Memorial on federal land." And that's what she did in a huge, huge gathering, maybe the biggest up till that point on federal land. And that's going to be amazing, wonderful, and awesome. And that was Eleanor Roosevelt standing up to racism. So again, that was just a little taste of her singing and so on. And again, Eleanor Roosevelt standing up to that racism and making a national, international incident out of this when powerful people stand up to racism. That is an idea of spreading ideas and telling young children this is not okay, and that is important. And that's why Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR get credit for doing this positive move, basically standing up against segregation. So a fifth aspect of how FDR interacted with racism and so on was Executive Order 8802. Now, there's going to be a problem during World War II, and that is that the federal government is going to have to spend a ton of money to make weapons to defeat Hitler. And that's going to create millions of jobs and creating like planes and everything else. African Americans were actually hired in these federal plants and these military institutions to make things. And that's good. But they still operated under this practice of they were the last hired and the first fired. And that resulted in less jobs and lower pay and so on. They often got the worst jobs in these plants. They would be, the custodians rather than the people actually working on the line and so on. So often they had the same job, but they got paid less due to racism, and nobody would stand up to them. So a civil rights leader at the time, maybe the civil rights leader of the 40s and 50s, a guy by the name of A. Philip Randolph, before Martin Luther King came along, this guy was the most famous and accomplished. He basically, some people say, is the father of the modern civil rights movement. So he basically gave an ultimatum to FDR. He said, "You know what? You want our country to come together to defeat Hitler, unify behind a war. Well, we're going to tear you apart. We're going to have massive protests against your practice of paying companies, and those companies are discriminating against African Americans. They're hiring them last, they're firing them first, they're giving them less money for the same work, they're getting the worst jobs, even though they're qualified for better. And if you allow this to happen, then what we're going to do is we're just going to protest, and we're going to protest the war and everything about you. And it's going to be a threat to do the March on Washington." FDR wants nothing to do with this. He knows the only way to win a war is to bring your country together in unison, everybody working together, not through protests and so on. So he passes Executive Order 8802, which is a very positive thing. It basically says there can be no workplace discrimination against African Americans. He created a group to investigate any claims that African Americans have been discriminated against. Now, this wasn't entirely successful, but it was partially successful, and it certainly was the beginning of something better. The establishment of the Fair Employment Practice Committee, 16 offices to do nothing but nonstop investigation of businesses that were discriminating against African Americans in the workplace. And it's just a small step, but such an important step, right? Every long journey begins with the first step, and FDR in this executive order is going to be huge. So that said, there was a lot of Southern resistance to this, but ultimately in the end, FDR pushed it through, said, "Self, you have to deal with this. You cannot discriminate in the war industries." So again, the lesson is A. Philip Randolph, he didn't play it nice. He actually had to make threats against FDR to push FDR to pass a bill to support African Americans in the workplace. So you got to be aggressive. You can't be nice. You can't be civil. Sometimes even with good people, you have to push them to do good things. And I think that's an important lesson. So even well-intentioned people need pressure. So that said, all right, other criticisms. So we've talked about people that are against FDR. We're talking about Huey Long, of course, our society was set up against the poor. Francis Townsend, our society is set up against the old people. African Americans, of course, weren't treated well, and the FDR is going to make some positive and some negative steps about that. But either way, another example is capitalists. Pure capitalists are going to be against FDR. Now, what does that mean? There are typically two types of economic systems, socialism and capitalism. The U.S. is entirely capitalist, particularly before FDR. And the criticism is that FDR's New Deal is going to take us away from a capitalist society and bring us much closer to a socialist society, right? And a lot of people are going to be really mad about that because that's like taking money away from hardworking Americans and then giving it to people that aren't even working, people that are vulnerable, people that aren't succeeding. Now, a lot of people think that FDR, with all of his New Deal social programs, were providing a safety net. In other words, when Americans screw up or get unlucky, there's now something to catch them, right? When they're old, they have Social Security, they have unemployment, all these things. It's nice to have a safety net. But some people say that when you give people a safety net, when they get hurt, they're not going to pick themselves up because the government's there to pick themselves up. And they'll become lazy and reliant on the government, and that's not a good thing. So just another example. Again, Huey Long was upset that FDR was not helping the poor. Townsend said, "You're not helping the elderly." African Americans were saying, you're allowing people to discriminate against us at work. Capitalists were saying, "You're turning our country into socialism, and that's going to make people lazy." Laissez-faire people also were mad at FDR. A lot of people think that the government's job is basically to mind its own business. Don't go after businesses or workers. Let them figure things out on their own. And that's what the government should do, laissez-faire, and that the government was getting way too big under FDR and all of his laissez-faire and all of his activism government and all those laws. So basically, some people said, no, a government that's too powerful and does too many things is abusive to the people. It takes too many freedoms away. Once the government becomes that powerful, they can take an endless amount of freedom. Look what Hitler did in the 1930s. He got a little power and he used it to get more power and then used that to get more power. So anyway, don't you remember what the British did? They were totally abusive to us. We can't let somebody have that much power. So a lot of people are like, no, the government needs to stay away from society, don't gain power, don't regulate, don't tell business what to do, which was entirely what FDR was doing. He was trying to save the common American. And a lot of people that supported laissez-faire were against it. Court packing plan. Now, court packing plan was maybe the greatest thing that people criticized FDR about. In 1929, the Great Depression occurred. It created a lot of misery. Roosevelt came up with the New Deal, all these laws to help the American people, but the Supreme Court said the Constitution doesn't allow all of these laws. You don't have the right to do this, FDR, and started declaring these programs to be unconstitutional and ripping them up and saying they couldn't exist. Roosevelt was upset, and there were 9 justices that had done this. He said, why don't I add 6 more justices? Because if I pass a law that adds 6 more justices, that means there's 6 empty seats, and the president gets to pick these 6 empty seats, and that means I'll pick people that think like me, and then I'll own the court because most of the people in the court like me. So the presidents do get to pick, and FDR's friends would be picked, and FDR then would control the Supreme Court, and that was the court packing plan. And people got really, really angry because it looked like Roosevelt was trying to take over one of the other branches of government. It looked like a power grab, a violation of separation of powers and checks and balances. And that was not seen that wasn't a good thing. FDR was becoming too powerful. So and you got to remember, at this time, right across the ocean was Hitler doing the exact same thing. This was not the most unrealistic thing. So the American people were not happy. And basically, this is going to be FDR's greatest error. He's going to be blamed. And you can argue that he lost the support of the American people. After this, he barely passed any laws. So the lesson here is be careful. Do not do things that make people think you're trying to gain power. They won't trust you anymore, and that is bad. Another criticism of FDR is the third term. Presidents forever have served only 2 terms. George Washington set that precedent, saying 2 terms is enough power for any one person. In 1880, Ulysses S. Grant tried. James Garfield tried. Neither were successful. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt went for a 3rd term, and he was unsuccessful. In 1940, Roosevelt goes for a 3rd term, and for the first time ever, somebody gets a 3rd term. And FDR's argument was, well, World War II is coming. Do you really want that guy in charge? Don't you want an experienced guy? And the American people agreed. They also loved FDR because of what he did during the Great Depression. So anyway, FDR said, I will keep us out of war, but ultimately that didn't happen. So people were really against. 2 times is enough for any man. Washington wouldn't, Grant couldn't, Roosevelt shouldn't. I'm against a 3rd term. Either way, a 3rd term is better than a 3rd-rater. So FDR wins his 3rd term, right? And in 1944, he runs again. And he actually gets elected to a 4th term. And a lot of people are like, God, he's turning into a king. But either way, he still wins and ultimately gets a 4th term. He dies at the beginning of the term. He maxes out at 13 years, but that is so much more than any other person. A lot of people thought he got way too powerful. And as a result, they're going to pass an amendment soon after FDR dies that says from now on, no presidents can run for more than 2 terms, or should I say get elected for more than 2 terms, and that's the 22nd Amendment. So another example of people that were against FDR was the St. Louis. In 1939, Hitler was running amok in Europe, killing Jews, or just about to, once World War II started. On May 13th, 1939, Jewish people all across Europe were having their rights violated, and over 1,000 Jews got onto a boat called the St. Louis, and they came to America to look for a place to survive. In fact, 937 people, excuse me, 937 people were on that boat, and they left, and they went to Cuba, and Cuba wouldn't let them go in, and they were just looking for asylum from the Nazis, and they spent 5 days in the harbor of Cuba saying, "Hey, let us in." Cuba said no, and they spent 5 days in the United States saying, "Please let us in." The United States said, "No, we're not letting you in." They were denied entry. At that time, the United States was very anti-immigrant, and basically said, "You know what? Also anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. We're not going to let these people in. There aren't enough jobs for us. Never mind other people." And ultimately, they're going to take our jobs, and all these anti-Semitic beliefs that Jewish people steal and take money. They're secretly communists because at the time most Jews of the world were in Russia, and the St. Louis was denied. FDR didn't even talk to them. So that said, you know what? FDR said, "You guys just have to wait in line like every other immigrant in the world that wants to come here." So the captain actually made a plan to run aground in the U.S. so that the Coast Guard couldn't stop them, and that everybody could run off and get to the U.S. But the seas were too rough. Ultimately, he had to turn around and he went back to Nazi-held Europe. Now, the great news is the United Kingdom eventually accepted 288 people, France 214, Belgium 224, Netherlands 181. But unfortunately, the Nazis invaded and attacked most of those countries, and most of those people ultimately were killed in Holocaust camps. 254 were estimated to have died. So maybe most didn't die, but a significant portion did. So FDR, you can argue, that was a big swing and a miss that resulted in a lot of people dying. Not a lot of empathy shown there. Finally, a group that was against FDR was a group called America First. 1940, Hitler looked strong and was dominating Europe. Great Britain looked like they were about to get conquered. FDR wanted to help Britain so that they would not be conquered by the evil empire of Germany. So, and he wanted to give them cash. He wanted to give them weapons. He wanted to give them 50 ships. But the American First group basically said, "No, you give them that stuff, we're not going to appear as neutral, and we're going to get sucked into the war with Hitler. We need that stuff to ourselves so we can protect ourselves." So FDR is basically giving away resources, America First said. We're going to get dragged into the war. Isolationism is what we need. We need to stay by ourselves. So the American First group and the isolationists are going to be very against FDR. So the criticisms of FDR were huge, even though he was the most popular president ever. Francis Townsend basically said that he wasn't taking care of old people. That resulted in Social Security. Huey Long said he wasn't taking care of poor people. That resulted in an income tax that taxed rich people more, and the passing of an estate tax. African Americans said you're being discriminatory against us, and that resulted in an executive order that basically said that war industries funded by the federal government couldn't pay African Americans less for the same work. Capitalists were pissed that FDR was moving our country towards socialism, and that was true. Laissez-faire were like, "FDR, you're becoming too involved in our country. The government's becoming too powerful," and that was true. The court packing plan basically made FDR look like he was grabbing power, and he lost a lot of support there. He went for a third and fourth term, and a lot of people were afraid about that. St. Louis, he would not accept the Jews off of that ship, and many of them are going to die, and that was a terrible thing. And finally, FDR is going to start supporting Great Britain, and that is going to get us pulled into World War II. And that American First group had a reason to be upset with him. So either way, you should be. My objective was for you to know all the imperfections and criticisms of FDR, and feel that we probably covered a lot of that. Either way, thank you for listening, and enjoy your day.